Good morning. You ever have one of those times when things just don't seem to go right? I'm sure none of us have ever had that experience. I know that a lot of our friends down in Texas sadly have had that experience of a lot of things not going right. But I think we've all had those times when things just don't quite seem to go right. I had that experience this week. I walked in to go about my work, and I heard Jim in the office saying, "I'm going to be late. We have a broken pipe." And I caught him in the hallway as he was heading towards the kitchen, and you may have seen these pictures online. We had a pipe break this week, and things just don't go right sometimes. We were very blessed in that it hadn't been going very long. Many people had simply walked through there recently, so we know it wasn't a long-standing thing, and we were able to get on it very quickly. Normally, that would not be the case. Normally, nobody's in that part of the building. If it had happened another day after, and most of us wouldn't have been up here till this Sunday, and then we'd have had a real mess on our hands. So we were very grateful. Something so small causing such a big mess. We've all had those near misses, those close calls, those setbacks. But sometimes we avoid the disaster. The last year has been such a year of setbacks, a year of close calls, a year of disasters. And as the states and the nation take stock, as many governors do their State of the States and the State of the Union, we have this tradition of saying, well, everything's good. And it's quite a fine needle to be both honest but also optimistic. Paul is very familiar with this concept of setbacks, this concept of difficult times. And that's what I want us to look at today. But before we do that, I want to welcome our guests. There's several that I see that I don't recognize, or maybe just the mask, and we haven't seen you in a while, and we're very glad that you're here. And I know that there's some who are joining us online, and we're very grateful that you're joining us this morning. There's two things I want to tell you about before we get started this morning. One is we're in a study of the book of Philippians, and the way that we're studying through the book of Philippians right now is in an attempt to teach you how to study on your own. Whether you're simply reading through the Bible and you have a question and you want to seek out an answer to that question, or if you want to go in depth like we're doing currently in this study of Philippians, I want to give you the tools that you need in order to do that. We believe that the Bible is an important book. And to that end, we want everybody to get it, both physically get it as well as understand it. And to that end, we're only teaching you how to study, but we're also giving Bibles away for free. So if you need one, please let us know. And we have several options as well. So if you need like large print, let us know that as well. Lately, we've been going through the tools that one needs in order to study the Bible. And we've covered all sorts of things. We've covered concordances. We've covered encyclopedias. We've covered articles. We've done everything from book format to online. And this last week, we even talked about the fact that there are commentaries and the benefit that commentaries can give. So we've talked a lot about the tools that are available to us. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. The Bible is the number one tool we have to studying the Bible. We read this thing again and again and again, and as we study, as we read, we understand more and more and more. These are simply tools to help us, to guide us, to assist us. That's all they are. This is what we want to study. This is what we want to get. Now, if there's one thing that you walk away from my series of lessons on studying the Bible, I want you to walk away with this. The most important key in studying the Bible is asking good questions and then seeking out the answers. Now, there are some traditional questions that you ask when you read through a book of the Bible and you begin to study a book of the Bible. We've answered some of these already. Who wrote the book? When was it written? To who was it written? Why was it written? What kind of literature am I dealing with here? What is the historical context? What is the context itself? These are some of the questions that we ask. One of the questions I think we need to wrestle with a little bit as we get into our study today, because it comes up in our text, is when was it written? When was the book of Philippians written? Well, there's lots of different things that add to our understanding in answering that simple question. One of the main things that we can ask is, well, it was written by Paul and co-authored by Timothy, so it had to be when these two guys were present together. As we'll read today, Paul was in prison when he wrote this, so at what points in time was he in prison? And when we find a time when Paul and Timothy were in prison together, or at least Timothy was assisting Paul in prison, we find a time when it's possible that this letter was written. So we look through timelines and we seek to understand those things. Now, last week I talked about how to use a commentary, but in my attempt to get through all the material I had to get through, I didn't actually use one. So I want to actually do that this morning. In the front of any group of commentaries, and this one has Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. So there's a lot of books in here. So you find the commentary book, and then in the beginning part of that is going to be introductory stuff, all those questions that you ask at the beginning. So I'm going to read just the first paragraph here, titled Date and Places of Origin. This is what the author has to say. Inasmuch as Paul was a prisoner at the time of Philippians was written, identification of this imprisonment would make it possible in fixing the date and place and the origin of the epistle. The three possibilities to consider are Caesarea, Rome, and Ephesus. So according to this commentator, there's three possible imprisonments in which the writing could have occurred. Now this little commentary here, which is in the church's library, goes into depth into this question and raises several possibilities as well. In addition to Caesarea, Rome, and Ephesus, we know that Paul was imprisoned in Philippi itself, as well as in Jerusalem. And he was also imprisoned again in Rome. So he was imprisoned at least twice in Rome. So there's lots of different possibilities. I personally come down on the side of Rome. I believe his first imprisonment in Rome at the end of the book of Acts is when he wrote this. And we'll get into some of that reasoning as we get into the text. That would put the date of this writing around 61 to 62 AD. Now, I found a timeline of Paul's life on blueletterbible.com. And assuming that the scholarship behind that is correct, the first visit in Philippi would have been around 51 AD. He would have been on his third missionary journey around 56 AD when he was in that area. Though we don't have a lot of discussion of him being in Philippi, it is most likely that he at least stopped in to say hi. So that puts the writing of this letter 10 years removed from their first meeting and the planting of that church, and about 5 years from the last time they may have saw him. So that kind of gives us an understanding of the timeline of separation in his writing of this letter. There's one more question I want us to wrestle with, and that is, why was the book written? And this morning I'm not going to answer that question, but I raise it for this purpose. For those of you who are studying along with me at home, I want you, as you're reading through the book, and I hope you are doing this, as you're reading through the book every week, maybe even multiple times a week, I want you looking for and asking that question. Why was this letter written? Why was this letter written? And I hope that you can come up with some ideas and some themes that come up again and again and again in the book. There's one more tool I want to introduce you to, and it comes from this concept that the most important tool we have in studying Scripture is the Scriptures, and that is comparing translations. Now, I covered this concept of translations a while back when we began this study. There's thought for thought, word for word, and then there's paraphrase. Those are kind of the main concepts out there. In the word for word, they go from the Hebrew and the Greek, and they try to have one word to one word equivalence. They try to stay as accurate to the layout of the Greek and the Hebrew into English as they can. Now, obviously, since Hebrew is written backwards, they don't write backwards. But the concept of language, they try to make that as one-to-one as possible. But for those of you who know languages, sometimes word for word doesn't work that well. So there's also thought for thought. Communicate the concept that's being communicated, not word for word. Sometimes a Greek word needs lots of words. Sometimes a Greek word has no equivalency, right? So there's the thought for thought. Then there's the paraphrase, and these tend to not be translations per se, as much as English to English expounding and something that kind of helps us get the text into our hearts. That kind of tends to be what those are. This next slide, I'm going to warn you, may be a little bit eye-hurting. I apologize ahead of time, but the base of the text is going to be the ESV, which is what we normally read out of, and then we have a bunch of other translations. Now, this is kind of my dyslexia moment because this helps me to visualize. Okay, this helps me to visualize the text side by side. It may be more helpful to actually you go through this exercise yourself, but we're going to read the text, and then we're going to kind of walk through this a little bit. So bear with me, this is not the most smooth reading thing there is. Philippians chapter 1, we're going to be there in verse 12. You may just want to read out of the Bible that you have in your hands. But I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that the circumstances, everything, the things concerning me that has happened to me has really, actually turned out, helped in serving the greater purpose and the spread and furtherance of the gospel or good news. Verse 13, as a result, so that it has become known, clear throughout the whole Praetorian Guard, Palace Guard, Imperial Guard, and all the places, and to all the rest, everyone else, and to all the other places, that my bonds, my chains, my imprisonments is because of Christ. Now, like I said, that's not the cleanest thing, but I found it helpful. So here's how I created it. I went to BibleHub.com, and they have more translations than you can shake a stick at. I think they have probably everything. And I just copied the first page of that verse, threw it into Microsoft Word, and just took the 8 top translations, skipping a few of the repetitive ones. So I didn't do all the New American Standard printings. I just did the New American Standard. So as we look at this, what are some observations? What are some observations here? The first one is how similar they all are. Now, you might be looking at that screen and your eyes are going cross and you're going, Michael, how can you say they're so similar? Well, the words that are interchangeable here change the meaning so slightly, so little. Now, there is things to be grappled with, and it helps us to kind of understand some of the things that are being wrestled with within the Greek here, and it keeps us from having to go to the Greek. But what we notice is how similar these words are. The greater progress, the spread, the furtherance of the gospel, the good news. There's no difference there. It's just different words that help us to wrestle with the text, and ultimately, that's exactly what we want to do. The first question that comes up is, how do we work with the conjunction that is at the beginning of this verse? Is it better to translate it and, which does have a Greek equivalent, which isn't here? Is it better to say now, connecting it with what's before? This was happening, now this. Or is it better to say but, drawing a contrast? I was talking about this, but now I'm going to talk about this. What is more appropriate? Or, as the ESV does, they just ignore it altogether and say it's self-explanatory. Which is better? The Living Bible, which is not a translation, it's a paraphrase, adds the concept of my dear brothers. That's not in the Greek, but the concept of the love and the compassion and the affection that Paul has is very much in the letter. So they add this concept of my dear brothers. Several translations add sisters to this concept, though not in the Greek, definitely in the concept that's being discussed there. So they add that aspect. Now, I think one of the most difficult things here probably comes out of the King James. And as you're kind of looking at this going, well, how can language change? How can the Bible change? The Bible's not changing. It's keeping up with our language. If you go back to the original printing of the King James Version back in 1611, I bet you couldn't read it. Or if you could, it would be very difficult for two reasons. One, the alphabet has changed. You would have to decode our own alphabet. Number two, our language has changed so much that you would be very hard-pressed to follow the trains of thought. It's important that our translations keep up with our current language and any of our sequences. The living, I've already talked about that. Now, the biggest deal in these comparison of translations probably does actually come out of the King James Version. It says, in all places and in all other places, or in all the palace and in all other places. This is probably the biggest questioning within the text when you're comparing. The King James Version would say that Paul is saying that in the palace where he is, and all those who are coming into contact with him, and all the places everywhere else. All the other translations I looked at talk about the imperial guard and then the palace. So that would be the biggest differing here. There's one other thing worth noting before we actually get into the heart of the text. And that would be that in verse 13, the order of the sentence is swapped in some translations. And I had no way of communicating that on this image without it getting way more complicated. So it's important to go through this exercise sometime of either just picking a translation and reading through, or sitting there side by side and comparing, or if you're like me and you like to put everything together, actually sitting there copying, pasting everything, and color-coding everything so that you can make sense of it at a glance. So those are some of the observations as I've looked at the concept of comparing translations. Now, like I said, let's get to the heart of the text. Let's talk about the text a little bit more. Why is Paul writing this? Well, Paul is writing this to encourage the church. He's to encourage the church because he finds himself in prison, and it would be very easy for them to find themselves confused and discouraged by the fact that Paul is in prison again. And notice I said again, because he was in prison in Philippi when he helped plant this church. So this is nothing new for them. They know Paul to be a bit of a jailbird. Paul is saying that his imprisonment, very much like in Philippi, is going to be a good thing for the gospel. It's a good thing for the gospel. And here's why. He says that their faith is being tested. And this is true, I think, throughout history. When our faith is being tested, when the church is persecuted, we're not currently under persecution. I don't think we should pray for persecution. We're called to pray for peace. But when the church is under persecution, it causes us to really take stock of our life. Is this true in my life? Is this something I truly believe? How far am I willing to go with this? Am I willing to go to be made fun of? Am I willing to be put in prison? Am I willing to lose my possessions? Am I willing to lose my life? And when we stop and we take stock of that, yes, some fall away, some leave and say, no, it's not worth it to me. But others double down. They begin to speak more boldly. They begin to believe it more strongly. And that's one of the benefits that Paul notices here. Now, as we look at verse 16, we notice that Paul is saying that he is in prison, and the benefit he currently sees, the first benefit that he begins to talk about, is that the guards he's around are being infected and affected by the gospel. And notice he says it's the Praetorian Guard. No, not that Praetorian Guard, that Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard are the soldiers who guard Caesar. They're the top. They're the elite of the elite. They're the leaders of Rome. And they would be there next to the king. Now, I think it's important that we understand that he's writing to a military audience. Paul is writing to a mostly Greek and Roman, mostly ex-military church. So while the Praetorian Guard can be referred to as the highest ranking guard in that city, under the jurisdiction of the governor or the mayor of a town, it mostly refers to the Praetorian Guard. And when you're talking to a military group, if you were to say the 101st, or the 1st, or the Big Red One, you wouldn't use that in a figurative sense to just mean the airborne, or to just mean a infantry division. There are actual divisions that mean that. There are actual groups, and if you're going to talk to a group of military guys, you better use the right terminology, and I think Paul is doing so. That's one of the main reasons I would put this in the first imprisonment in Rome, towards the end of that imprisonment, right before he's released. As Paul looks at this difficult situation, what he sees is God at work. He sees God at work in his life, allowing him, very much like he did when he was in Philippi, to affect the soldiers he's around. The soldiers who are therefore also around Caesar himself. He's also affecting the household of Caesar, those in that circle. The gospel is right on the door mat of the king. And Paul is excited about the possibility of the gospel reaching the leader of the Roman people. Look at what he says in verse 14. And most of the brothers, having become more confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. This is exactly what we were talking about earlier. The fact that when we face persecution, we have a choice to make. Am I going to speak up, or am I going to shrink back? Paul is encouraged by the effect not only of outreach possibilities amongst the Roman guards, amongst the Roman people, he's also excited about the work that's being done in the church itself. That there are those who are speaking up, who are being more bold in their proclamation of the gospel. Then in verse 15 through 18 we read, some indeed preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others do so from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Paul says there's two groups of preachers. There's two groups that come out of this kind of setback. There are those who are emboldened, which we've already talked about, those who examine their faith and say, I'm absolutely ready to do whatever it takes to stand on the gospel and proclaim the gospel. Then there's another group. There's a group who is doing so out of envy, out of rivalry, out of competition. They want to be number one. And it's kind of shocking that there would be a group who would try to compete with Paul, who would seek to use this opportunity as a way to get ahead, to get a name for themselves, why Paul is in prison. But that's exactly what he's proclaiming. Now, I think it is worth noting that Paul is not saying that there is a group going around spreading false doctrines. What's under discussion is the motivation. What's motivating these guys to speak? Is it out of love for the gospel, love for the Lord, or is it out of a desire to be number one? To compete with Paul and to be seen as the best evangelist out there? What is their motivation? That is really what's being discussed here. Now this is, I believe, one of, there are several keys here within understanding the reason for the writing of the book. And one of these is Paul leading by example, and the other is conflict resolution. Paul leads by example in the issue of conflict resolution here, because these guys, the second group of preachers, are picking a fight with Paul. They're jabbing at him. They're kicking him while he's down. He's in prison. He finds himself hamstrung, unable to do all the things he wants to do. He could very easily be complaining about the lack of freedom that he has, all the places he wants to go. And this group of preachers are trying to one-up him in this situation. But notice how Paul decides to react to this conflict, this attempt at an argument. Paul makes a decision not to fight. He makes a decision to not let it bother him, but instead to look on the bright side, to see what's going on, not from his own perspective, but from God's perspective. He chooses to see how God's reacting to the situation, what good is being done. Because ultimately, as much as he would like for the motivation of all of these men to be out of good, out of a desire to see people prosper, out of a love and compassion, as much as he would like to see that, the big point is that the gospel is going forth. That the gospel is being proclaimed, that souls are being saved. That's what really matters. He understands that God is the one at work, and he's trusting himself to that. He's entrusting the gospel to its own power, knowing that it's not about his own pride. It's not about his own accomplishments. It's about God. That's what it's about. So as we look at all of this, what's the application for us? What is the takeaway for us this morning? Well, Paul finds himself at a difficult point in time, facing lots of setbacks, with a lot of distance between those he loves and he wants to be around. Anyone else find that to be a good, familiar situation? I think we find ourselves very similarly in a difficult situation with lots of setbacks, separated from those we want to spend time with. Paul chooses to be positive. He chooses to see what God is doing, how God is at work, and he refuses to fight with those who would pick a fight with him. Paul chooses to focus on how God is at work in the guards in Caesar's household, how close the gospel is to Caesar's household. He chooses to look at the faith of the church and how its current testing will result in its benefit, its strengthening. That's what Paul chooses to focus on, understanding that the church will be stronger for it, recognizing that the gospel is indeed still going forth, and he rejoices in hardships. He rejoices in hard times. So like we looked at last week, like we looked, 2 weeks ago, and like we're looking at this week, Paul's life, the way he conducts himself while in these difficult situations, allows the gospel to go forth. That happened in Philippi, as him and Silas sat in prison singing, worshiping, praising God, and that's happening as he conducts himself in the presence of the Praetorian Guard, as he's in prison for the gospel. And yet he's rejoiceful, he's happy, he's encouraged, he's respectful. We see that example in him. And I think we should see that example, hopefully, within us. As we look at our own lives, are we looking at these difficult situations, looking for a way to let the gospel light shine forth? Are we living in such a way that when people look at the difficult times we're all going through and they say, hey, that person has hope, that person has encouragement, that person has joy? Or are we walking around like everybody else with our head down, defeated? Paul gives us an example here, an encouragement here. And the question is, will we do the same? Will we follow his example? Will we see the good work that God is doing among us? Will we refuse to let people pick fights with us? Will we lead by example? Will we rise above it all? I hope we will. I hope we will. The body of Christ always stands ready to help in any way that we can. And as we come to the end of our lesson this morning, as always, I want to extend the invitation. I want to let you know that if you need the prayers of the congregation, if you need the encouragement of the congregation, if you need counsel, if you need to study with somebody and to come to a better knowledge of who Christ is and to understand what the Bible's saying, however we as the body of Christ can assist, we want to do that. We want to meet you where you are with your needs right now. as we stand and as we sing.